Welcome to Pragim Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 115 of ASP.NET video series. In this video, we'll discuss about solving the problems of the ASP.NET composite custom calendar control that we have been working with from parts 112 to 114. If you haven't watched these videos, I would strongly encourage you to do so before continuing with the session. So if you remember, the composite custom calendar control that we have developed has several issues. For example, look at this. When the control first renders, we don't want this calendar to be visible. We want to hide this. Okay, that's one of the problems. So let's see how to hide the calendar when the custom calendar control is first loaded. And to do that, it's pretty simple. So let's flip to our custom controls project. So within custom controls project, if you remember, we have this create child controls method, which is actually responsible for creating the child controls, the text box, the image button, and the calendar. So within that method, we actually need to hide the calendar when we are creating it. So here we have the calendar object. We are assigning the ID to that, and all I have to do here is when I render that, I want to turn the visibility to false. So calendar.visible is equal to false. So this should hide the calendar, okay, when it initially renders. So that's the first problem. So solving the first problem is pretty much easy. Hiding the calendar control when the custom calendar control is first loaded. How do we do that? All we have to do is set the visible property of the calendar object to false and create child controls method. Alright. So what's the second problem we have? Displaying and hiding the calendar when the image button is clicked. So at the moment, if you look at the behavior of this custom calendar control, now the calendar is already shown, and then clicking on this button has no effect. It simply posts back to the server, but really doesn't do anything. Okay, so initially when this control loads up, the calendar should be invisible. When I click this image button, then the calendar should become visible. If I click the image button again, then the calendar should become invisible. So basically, on the click of this image button, the visibility of the calendar should be toggled. If it is displayed, you have to hide it. If it's hidden, you have to display it. Okay, to do that, the first step is to actually generate the event handler for that image button. So again, back to the custom controls project, and if you look at create child controls method, okay, here we are rendering the image button. We are creating the image button. So now we basically want to associate an event handler method to the click event of the image button. So image button dot click. So when I click, when this click event is raised on this image button, we want to associate an event handler method. And how do we do that? We hook up the event handlers to the events of a control using delegates. We have discussed about events and delegates in the previous sessions of this ASP.NET video series. If you haven't watched them, I would strongly encourage you to do so before continuing with the video. Alright, so to hook up the event handler, I use plus equals, and then look at that. Visual Studio will show you the IntelliSense. Now if you press tab, it will automatically generate the code snippet for us. And look at that, we are using image click event handler delegate to hook up image button underscore click method with the click event of the image button. So I press tab again, the event handler should be generated. So image button click. Okay, let's do that again. So dot click plus equals, and now when I press tab, look at that, I press tab 2 times, the event handler method gets generated. Okay, so now we need to control the visibility of the calendar within the click of this button. So all you need to do is, if the calendar object, if it is visible, what we want to do, we want to turn off the visibility. So set the visibility of the calendar. So visible property is itself a Boolean property. So if it is true, then we know that the calendar is visible. In that case, we want to turn off the visibility. Else, we want to turn on the visibility. So calendar.visible is equal to true. So that should solve our second problem, displaying and hiding the calendar when the image button is clicked. So if it's displayed, it will be hidden. Otherwise, it will be displayed back. Okay, so what's the third problem? populating the text box control with a date that is selected from the calendar. So at the moment, you look at this, I have the calendar control visible here, but when I select a date, basically nothing happens. But what should happen in reality, whatever date the user selects here, that selected date should be populated within the text box control. Let's see how to do that. Again, if we have to do that, then we have to first associate an event handler for the selection changed event of the calendar control. We do it the same way as we have done it for the image button control. So I have the calendar control here. So calendar dot selection changed, that's the event, and to that let's associate an event handler method, calendar underscore selection changed event handler method. And in this method, what we need to do basically, when the date is selected within the calendar control, we need to populate that into the text box control. And to do that, I already have some code typed here. So let's copy and paste that code there. So what are we doing here? We are retrieving the selected date property of the calendar object and then converting that to short date string, and then setting that as the text for the text box control. It's as simple as that. And finally, we also need to turn off the visibility. Okay, so when I select the date from the calendar control, that date should be populated within the text box control, and this calendar should become invisible. That's what is done by these two lines here. So that should solve our third problem as well. And what is the final problem? We should be able to retrieve the selected date from the custom calendar control when we use that on a web form. Now at the moment, if you look at this calendar control, we are using this calendar control on this web form 9.aspx. Now let's say, for example, I have a button control. So let's drag and drop a button control from the toolbox onto the web form. Now when I double click this button control, we have the event handler generated. Now if you look at this calendar control, the custom calendar control, the ID of that one is custom calendar 1 control. Now if I go into the code behind page, and then if I try to retrieve, let's say for example, when I select the date in the calendar, it's populated in the text box control. Now let's say I want to retrieve that selected date from this calendar control on a web form. Okay, so now does this calendar control has any property which exposes the selected date? It doesn't have it. So in the button, when I say calendar 1 dot I don't have a property that can return the selected value from the control. So we need to expose a property that returns the selected date. So wherever we are using, we can use that property to retrieve the selected date from that particular control. So let's go ahead and add selected date property to the calendar control. So let's copy this, and if you remember in the previous session we discussed about image button image URL property, so it's very much similar to that property. So let me paste this property here and then we'll go through the code. So if you look at this property, the name of the property is selected date. Now we know that a date is a date time data type, so the data type is date time. So it returns date time data type. And look at this, we have this category attribute and description attribute. You know what these attributes are for. We discussed about them when we were discussing about image button image URL property. The category will be the category under which this property will be displayed, whereas description will be the description, basically which appears when that property is selected in the properties window. Alright, so this property has got get and set accessors. Now what should this property do? Basically this property should be able to return the value that the user has selected. So if you look at this, obviously we have to call this ensure child controls method. We have discussed about the significance of this method in the previous sessions of this video series. If you don't know what the purpose of this method, I strongly recommend to watch those videos first. Alright, so ensure child controls a call to that method. And then what are we doing here? Basically we are checking if there is any text at all in the text box. If there is a text in the text box, if it's not null or empty, then if it is basically null or empty, look at that, we are using a conditional operator here. So if this expression evaluates to true, that means we know that in the text box we don't have any text there, in which case return the minimum date time value. if somebody tries to retrieve the property of that text box of that control. Okay, otherwise if there is something within the text box, then what are we doing? We are converting that text into a date time and returning that back to the user. Okay, so basically that's the get accessor. And what should the set accessor do? So when somebody sets this value, the selected date property, what should happen? We should take that value and populate that into the text box control. So if value is not equal to null, meaning if somebody has set a value, then ensure there are child controls, and then set the text to, we are converting the value to a short date string, and then setting it to the text property of the text box control. And then look at this, we are also setting, actually instead of selected date, I will say visible date. And this is very important, because when you set a value within the text box control, and then when I click the image button, when the image button displays the calendar, the calendar should show the date that we have currently typed into the text box. Okay, which is very much user friendly, because if in the text box, let's say I have 1/1/1940, and then when I click on the image button, when the calendar shows today's date, let's say for example 10/10/2013, and if the user has to navigate back to 1940, just imagine how many clicks he has to take. Okay, that's why whatever date that he types into the text box control, if the calendar, if you make the calendar visible at that point of time, make sure the calendar's visible date is the date that the user has typed into the text box control. That's why we have this here. Okay, on the other hand, if the if the value is null, meaning I didn't set anything, I have sent an empty value or an empty string, in that case, look at that, we are setting it to empty string, but I'm setting the visible date to current date and time, that is today's date and time. So a very simple property with simple get and set accessors. Okay, so we have this control. Let's go ahead and rebuild this solution. So rebuild the custom control calendar project. Now let's go back to the demo ASP.NET Web Application project where we are testing this. So first thing, I'm going to remove the reference to this assembly, and I'm also going to get rid of that calendar control from there. And then from the toolbox, let's go ahead and remove that. So choose items, this should bring up the choose items dialog box. From this, let's go ahead and remove the custom calendar control. Alright, so that should remove that. And also, just to be safe, let me remove this from the project references build solution, and let's ensure we don't have this in the bin folder. So let's go to the bin folder. Look at that, that's still there. Let me go ahead and remove the custom controls assembly from there. Okay, so let's build the solution once, and then let's go back to toolbox and re-add the assembly. So choose items, from the choose items dialog box, click the browse button, navigate to C drive, and within C drive we have custom controls project. From this, select bin, debug, and the assembly itself. Click OK. So we have our custom calendar there. Let's drag and drop it onto the web form. So I want the calendar to be visible there. And if you remember, within the solution explorer, we have this images folder which has got this calendar.jpg. So let's go ahead and set that property. So that property is image button image URL that is present in images / calendar.jpg. So that should show the image immediately. And look at this, we have the selected date property as well. Okay, now if I select a date, look at that, since the date selected date is date time data type, Visual Studio is smart enough to show a calendar for the user to actually select a date rather than him typing it manually here. So I click on the drop down list, I get a calendar here, and I select 15/01/2013. And look at this, as soon as I have selected that value there, look at what happened to the control on the designer surface. It's immediately updated because we have a call to ensure, we have that recreate child controls method. We have overridden that. So recreate child controls method. This method updates the designer surface. Okay, so that's selected date. Let's go ahead and run this now. So look at this. At the moment, as soon as we have added that control, look at that here. The first problem is solved. When the control initially loads up, the calendar is not visible. Now when the user clicks this image button, that's when the calendar is visible. Okay, if I click the image button again, look at that, the calendar becomes invisible. Okay, and another thing to notice is that when I select, look at this, at the moment we have 15 of January 2013. If I select 16, the date is properly selected and the calendar becomes invisible as well. So that problem is also solved, populating the text box control with the date that we have selected in the calendar. And how to retrieve the selected date from the custom calendar on a web form? Again, it's pretty much easy. Now we have selected date property, so I can say, what's the ID of this one? The ID, I think, is custom calendar 1. So that's the ID. So let's take that, and within the button click event, all we need to do is custom calendar 1, and if you remember the property, it's selected date dot to string. So let's go ahead and say response dot write. In reality, we may save it to the database or do whatever you want with that property. So let's run this now. And look at this, I have 15/01/2013 selected. I click that button, I get that date. Okay, basically I haven't converted it to short date string. If you convert it to short date string, you'll only get the date part of that. Okay, so if I select 26, click the button, 26/01/2013. Now there's one problem with this calendar control still at the moment. Now look at this. In the image button click, when we click the image button, at the moment, if the calendar is not visible, we are making it visible. If it's already visible, then we are turning off the visibility. Okay, but then one thing that we need to do is, let's say, let me run this project once again. Now let's say I have the date as 01/01/1940, and then I click this image button. Look at this, it's currently showing January 2013. Now instead of that, I actually want to show whatever date that I have typed in here, because let's say if I want to change the date from 01/01/1940 to 01/02/1940, maybe January 2nd 1940. Now just imagine how many clicks would it take to navigate back to the year 1940. Okay, so to solve that problem, I have a code snippet here. So what are we doing? Now if the calendar is visible, turn the visibility to false, that's fine. But on the other hand, if it's not visible, then we need to turn the visibility on. But when I'm turning the visibility on, so look at this, I'm setting the visibility to true, but then I'm also checking if the text box is not null or empty, then set the visible date of the calendar to, if it is empty, set the visible date to today. Else, if it's not empty, then we know there is something within the text box. So first I'm declaring a variable of date of type date time as output, and I'm initializing that to today. And then look at what am I doing here. I'm using this try parse method to convert whatever text that I have in the text box to date time. If that conversion is successful, I'm using this variable to to convert that whatever text that we have in the text box to a date time data type, and then put that within this output variable. Okay, output variable. So today's date will be changed to whatever date that we have in the text box control. On the other hand, if the conversion is not successful, what happens? This try parse method will return false. Okay, if it's not successful, then we know output has today's date. Okay, so basically two things will happen. If there is text within the text box control, meaning somebody has entered some date within the text box, what this else part will try to do, it will try to convert that to date time. If the conversion is successful in the sense, if I have entered a valid date and time, then the conversion will be successful, and that date will be stored in this output variable, which is then assigned to the visible date property of the calendar. Okay, so basically let's change the image button click event handler to have this code instead of that straightforward code. At the moment, if you look at that image button click, it's pretty simple and straightforward. All we are doing here is if the calendar is visible, turn the visibility to false. Otherwise, if it's not visible, turn the visibility on. Instead of that, I'm going to paste this piece of code here. Okay, so let's rebuild this, and let's go to the web project where we are testing this. Let me remove the reference to the register directive and then the custom control itself. Let's remove the assembly from the toolbox. So right click, choose items, and uncheck custom calendar. Click OK. Just to be safe, remove the reference from the references folder and clean the solution, rebuild the solution just to make sure. Let's actually check if we still have that particular custom controls assembly. I don't want that to be there. And then obviously we get an error now because custom calendar is not there. Let's comment that line for the time being. Okay, let's go ahead and re-add the custom calendar control. So choose items, and before we do that, let's actually rebuild custom controls project. So this is the custom controls project. Rebuild all succeeded. Let's flip back to the ASP.NET project, click the browse button, and within the C drive, navigate to custom controls, bin debug, select the assembly, click OK. That should add the custom calendar. So let's drag and drop that onto the web form. So we have that. Let's also set the image button image URL property. That's going to be, let's copy the image name, which is calendar.jpg, and within the properties, let's set image button image URL to images/calendar.jpg, which should pick that up. And let's go ahead and run this as it stands now. Now I'm going to change the date within the text box directly by hand to something in 1940. So 1/1/1940. Okay, now look at this. If I click the image button, when the calendar shows up, it should check the content of this text box. Now this is not empty. Okay, look at this. If it's going to be empty, if I click the image button, it's going to show us today's date and time. Okay, so January 2013. Now on the other hand, if I have text there, okay, or let me actually turn off the visibility. Let's have today's date. So there is some text within that. So I click that button. Look at that. It's now showing January 1940. Okay, so the user, if he wants to select 2nd of January of 1940, it's simple and straightforward. Okay, so that's what this property is actually doing here, the else part here. Alright. So in this video, we discussed about solving all these problems. In our next video, we'll discuss about adding an event to our custom control. It's actually very similar to adding events to user controls. We have discussed about user controls in the previous sessions of this video series, so you can check those videos as well. So in our next video, we'll discuss about adding events to our custom control. On the slides, you can find resources for ASP.NET, C# and SQL Server interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.